Hi, welcome to your Statistical Process Control online classes. Today we're going to start Chapter 2. This is the first of a series of two videos in which we will be expanding our understanding through the concept of process. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let's start with the objectives of this chapter. We're going to start with a further examination of the concept of process management and improving customer satisfaction. Next, we will introduce a systematic approach to understand the customer-supplier relationships and defining, standardizing, designing, modifying, and improving a process. With that, we'll be ready to describe the various techniques of block diagramming and flowcharting, and to show their use in process mapping, examination, and improvement. And finally, we'll learn how to position process mapping and analysis in the context of business process redesign and reengineering. We start with some basic notions of process management and how we should carry out process management in order to achieve our main goal, which is improving the customer satisfaction. Here is an approach to improvement based on what we call process alignment, starting with the definition of the organization's vision and mission, then the establishment of the critical success factors, which are quantifiable metrics that should be very well aligned with the customer satisfaction requirements. And lastly, we should go ahead and break down the core process links by mapping out all process steps. For this, certain tools, techniques, and interpersonal skills will be required for good communication around the processes that are managed by the system. And those elements are for people to identify and solve problems as teams and form the components for the application of the SPC techniques. Now, let's see an example illustrating how a typical organization operates. Most organizations have a management board, which is responsible for managing different teams according to their specific functions in the organization. Each functional team or department is composed by experts with similar skills capable of completing any task in that discipline. For example, the research and development department is most likely composed by PhD scientists and engineers, whereas the finance department might be composed by skilled accountants and finance experts. This vertical management system has been used for decades, and sometimes it can limit the organization's ability to operate effectively in addressing the customer satisfaction because of the lack of synergy between functions and no clear understanding of how one department's activities affect the total process of attaining the customer satisfaction. With this typical vertical operation, managers can remain tied to managing singular functions, with rewards for their narrow missions, inhibiting a shared external customer perspective. An alternative and more effective way to manage the organization is through the concept of cross-functional management of the process, in which the departments and their respective functions share a horizontal view of the business. This approach requires shifting the work focus from a functional management perspective to a process management perspective. Process managers can then work to ensure that departments understand how their individual work affects the other departments, and more importantly, how they add to the entire process of satisfying the customer. Big companies like Google and Apple are perfect examples of this horizontal management approach. Now, let's understand how we define and collect information about the process. As we saw in the previous chapter, flowcharts are the best tools available to understand the step-by-step of a process. So they are one of the first things we need to build. But before we start drawing flowcharts, we have to be able to identify the following key issues. We have to define which are the supplier-customer relationships. We have to define the process itself. We have to standardize the process. Based on data collection, we have to decide if we are going to design a new process or modify an existing one. And we have to be able to identify complexities and opportunities for improvement on the process. Let's start by trying to define the relationship between suppliers and customers. For this task, let's assume that we are owners of a process. And by applying this rule, we can establish a set of questions that can help us to understand the supplier-customer relationship. The first two questions are about the identification of the customer and what his or her needs are. Depending on the answers given for those two questions, changes in the process should be proposed, keeping the focus on the customer satisfaction. Let's keep in mind that we may also have multiple customers, all of them with different expectations. For example, if your product is a software that organizes information about the location and amount of inventory in a logistics company, we may have production planners, material handlers, purchasing staff, and accountants as customers. Next, we should ask ourselves which supplies or inputs we need to run the process, and who is going to supply it, when, and how. Finally, if we intend to improve the process, we can ask ourselves what changes can be made on the supplies and/or suppliers in order to increase the satisfaction of internal or external customers. Do you remember the CPOC chart we talked about in the previous video? This chart is an excellent tool to organize all the answers for those questions. The next step is defining the process itself, which is a very important task, especially if the process is intended to be improved. When a process is to be analyzed for the first time, the main focus should be to capture everyone's current knowledge of it. And this should come from a brainstorming session with the people who actually operate or use the process, day in and day out, not from a technical expert, usually a process manager, engineer, or supervisor. Those experts' ideas and inputs should come at the end of the session, just for a better description of how the process actually works. During this initial phase, it's important to keep the focus on the description of how the process currently is, not on how it could or should be. Trying to discuss ideas about the process now could be distracting to the main purpose of the exercise, and those activities should be discussed later. After at least the most important operations in the process being identified, the next step is to draw a comprehensive flowchart of the entire process. A flowchart will help us to have an overview of the relationships between all operations, inputs, outputs, and specific details in the process. Let's consider, for example, the brewing process mapped out in this flowchart here. It's easy to see that the process has 9 main operations arranged in the sequence shown here. Also, the inputs of each operation can be clearly seen through the flowchart. And the same happens to the outputs here. In the flowchart, we can also see specific information regarding some operations, such as the time and temperatures recommended for the mashing and the times recommended for the boiling, fermenting, and conditioning operations. Usually, it's natural to draw flowcharts to study manufacturing processes, but they are equally important for non-manufacturing processes. In those type of processes, the operations, inputs, and outputs sometimes are not clearly recognizable, which requires more attention to organize everything in a flowchart. The next step down the line regards the standardization of the process. A common problem found in most of the processes that need improvement is the excessive variation in its final outcomes. And we all can imagine that variations out of control can lead to serious quality issues. For possible causes of variation in the process, we have, for example, the use of different methods and procedures by those working in the process, the lack of proper documentation of the process, and the inadequate training and inadequate supervision of the process. However, the solution for those problems passes first through an appropriate process flow charting, and then through the development of standard procedures followed by the operators. It has already been proved that process standardization, developed with the help of supervisors and technical experts, can potentially result in a significant reduction in the variation of the process outcomes. The next step in gathering information about the process is understanding if the process is going to be designed from scratch or if it will be adapted or modified from a process that already exists. This is a very important question because if we're going to start from an existing process, then we should have access to any documentation available for that process, flowcharts, or any relevant information that would allow us to address the key aspects of the process. Then, based on a detailed comparison between the existing and the new intended process, we'll be able to identify weaknesses and areas for improvement. The last step on the process information line is related with the identification of potential complexities in the process and opportunities for improvement. For that, we usually apply two golden rules, which pretty much describe how any process behaves in reality. Rule number 1, in any process, things can go wrong. And rule number 2, wrong things can make simple tasks become quite complex. Let me give you one example of how those two rules work together. Imagine that you work in the IT department of an airline company, and you are responsible for the computer systems used to document reservations, assign seats, and print tickets for passengers. If this system fails, the usually simple task of assigning a seat to a passenger becomes very difficult to accomplish, which can drive you crazy if you're not prepared for that. For this reason, only through a proper documentation of all steps in the process, you would be able to identify things that potentially can go wrong, indicate the increasing complexity when things go wrong, and then identify opportunities for improving quality and increasing productivity. With that, we have finished the first part of Chapter 2. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.